The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to stand in this place and offer my support for Bill C-44, Protection of Canadians from Terrorists Act. Over the past few months, Canadians have been rightly outraged at the atrocities committed by ISIL. Their barbarism cannot and should not be ignored. To do so would be to leave a ticking bomb with a lit fuse, one that stretches from Iraq to our shores. We saw this on October the 20th and October 22nd when 2 Canadian Armed Forces soldiers were killed in cold blood. The terrorists responsible for these atrocities did so in a planned and calculated way in an attempt to intimidate Canadians into bowing to the terrorist caliphate known as the Islamic State. Mr. Speaker, this is the very definition of terrorism. The President of France, the U.S. Secretary of State, and most importantly, the Commissioner of the RCMP have all confirmed this point. Mr. Speaker, we must, at all costs, degrade and destroy the threat posed by ISIL. That is why our government joined our allies to defuse the threat of ISIL at the source. However, military action is only one element of our response to terrorism. The other is gathering intelligence to confront the diverse array of threats to our security. This is easier said than done. The landscape for intelligence work is rapidly evolving, and we need to ensure that our security and intelligence agencies have the tools they need to keep Canadians safe and secure. The world of terrorism has changed dramatically since the 1980s. The CSIS Act, which today's legislation seeks to modernize, was originally written in the era of the Cold War and the rotary telephone. Violent extremism has taken new forms, and the threats to Canadians are both more numerous and more sophisticated. The 2014 public report on the terrorist threat to Canada identified more than 130 individuals with Canadian connections who were abroad and suspected of supporting terror-related activities. As we heard recently from CSIS, this number includes some 50 individuals who are known to be working directly with ISIL and other extremist groups in the region. These extremist travelers pose a threat both to people in foreign countries and to the citizens of Canada. We must stop them from inflicting harm on others. That is exactly what we are doing with the legislation before us today. We know that we must approach the threat of terrorism and extremist travelers from many angles. This means bringing into force on an earlier timeline the new citizenship revocation provisions, which help protect the safety and security of Canadians and safeguard the strong values associated with Canadian citizenship. That is the goal of the first part of the Protection of Canada from Terrorists Act. We are proposing technical amendments to the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, which received royal assent on June 19, 2014. As you have heard, Mr. Speaker, these amendments will allow for earlier implementation of provisions related to revocation of Canadian citizenship. These provisions include expanded grounds for revocation of citizenship and a more streamlined decision-making process to allow the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration to make revocation decisions depending on the grounds. Our government firmly believes that we must move quickly to implement provisions that permit the revocation of Canadian citizenship from those radicalized individuals who are convicted of an act of terrorism or who travel overseas to engage in armed conflict with Canada. We will not hesitate to do what is necessary to protect our country and other innocent citizens of the world who may fall victim to acts of terrorism overseas. Revocation is an important tool to safeguard our strong Canadian values and the integrity of our citizenship program. And while we have strengthened our citizenship laws, we know that there are already individuals who have left Canada to join extremist groups, and we must ensure that we can track and intercept those individuals before they commit acts of terrorism. With the second part of this legislation, we will work to do just that. The proposed amendments to the CSIS Act will add another tool to our counterterrorism toolbox. CSIS is a highly professional organization that has succeeded in adapting its tactics and tools to keep up with the ever-changing environment. However, the time has come to amend its governing legislation, the CSIS Act. In doing so, we can ensure that CSIS is well positioned to take reasonable and necessary measures to investigate threats to the security of Canada wherever they may occur. Reasonable people can agree that CSIS must have this ability. Threats to the security of Canada are more global and complex than they were when the CSIS Act came into force. Allow me now to highlight the major amendments proposed by this legislation. The first major amendment, then, is to confirm CSIS authority to conduct investigations outside of Canada related to threats to the security of Canada and security assessments. CSIS has always had the authority to undertake investigative activities outside of Canada. However, this authority is not as clearly stated in the CSIS Act as it needs to be. It is important that Parliament provide clarity on this matter. This is a limited and focused amendment, one that merely confirms CSIS' existing authority and makes it even more explicit in law. We cannot afford to leave any gray areas with respect to the scope of CSIS' mandate. Equally important, we need to clarify the jurisdiction of the federal court to issue warrants authorizing CSIS to undertake certain intrusive activities outside of Canada. To enable CSIS to properly investigate threats outside of Canada, the proposed amendments would clarify that the federal court need only consider the CSIS Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms when determining whether a warrant is required. A third major amendment concerns protection of sources. Common law has long afforded protections for the identity of police informants. Without such protection, witnesses may be reluctant to come forward and criminals may not be prosecuted. The stakes are just as high when it comes to threats to Canada's national security. Through the information of human sources, CSIS may be able to help thwart an attack on Canadians and Canadian interests. Obviously, the ability to recruit human sources depends on their confidence that their identity will in fact be protected. Some honourable members may be surprised to learn that the current CSIS Act does not explicitly protect the identity of intelligence sources during court proceedings. This bill would fill that gap. This protection will, of course, be consistent with Canadian values of protection of individual rights and the rule of law. If the information is required in a criminal proceeding to demonstrate the innocence of the accused, the protection can be overturned. The CSIS Act also has shortcomings that must be addressed with respect to protecting the identity of CSIS employees. Currently, it is an indictable offense to reveal the identity of a CSIS employee who is or has been involved in covert operations. However, the existing legislation does not protect those employees who are not yet, but may be engaged in covert activity in the future. Another amendment addresses this oversight. In this way, CSIS employees who are training to become covert officers can be assured their identities will be protected. In summary, the amendments proposed today would allow for earlier implementation of citizenship revocation provisions, protect Canadians and other innocent citizens from the acts of violence carried out by extremist travelers, and give our intelligence service more effective tools and clearer authorities to fight violent extremism, including violence perpetrated by Canadians themselves. Mr. Speaker, I urge all honourable members to join me today in supporting the protection of Canada from terrorist acts. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.